Candlelight made the divorce papers glow like a victory trophy as Mitchell's mother slid them across the white tablecloth. And in that moment, Alina finally understood that some people give you freedom when they think they're giving you pain. Alina Queen had known. Something was wrong the moment she walked into Marcello's. The restaurant was too quiet for a birthday celebration, the air thick with anticipation rather than joy. Mitchell Owen sat at the head of the table wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, his phone already positioned at an angle she recognized from every other performance he'd staged for his family's approval. His mother, Constance, occupied the seat of honor to his right, dressed in ivory silk that probably cost more than Alina's car, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the stem of her wine glass with the rhythm of someone counting down to an explosion they'd carefully orchestrated. The rest of them were arranged like an audience at an execution. Mitchell's father, Bernard, pretended to read the menu he'd already memorized from monthly visits. His sister, Vanessa, whispered something to her husband that made him snort into his napkin. His brother, Trevor, raised his wine glass in a toast that hadn't been offered yet, his lips already curved in anticipation of a punchline only he'd been told. They were all waiting for something. And Alina sat down in the empty chair they'd left for her with the strange calm of someone who'd been drowning for so long that going under one final time felt almost like rest. "We ordered for you," Constance announced, her voice carrying that particular sharpness she reserved for waitstaff and daughters-in-law. "The chicken, plain. We know you've been watching your figure, though perhaps not closely enough." Alina said nothing. She'd learned that silence was safer than defense, that anything she said would be used as evidence of her inadequacy. She folded her hands in her lap and watched Mitchell's phone light catch the edge of his water glass, creating small rainbows that danced across his knuckles like promises he'd forgotten he made. "We have something for you," Constance continued, producing a box wrapped in expensive paper, the kind that whispered rather than crinkled, "A gift. From all of us." The box was too flat for jewelry, too light for anything substantial. Alina took it with both hands because that's what you did when someone offered you something, even when you knew it would hurt. The card taped to the top read, "Happy birthday to our mistake," in Constance's perfect calligraphy. Each letter precise enough to cut. Inside the box, nestled in tissue paper like something precious, were divorce papers. Not a joke, not a prank. Real documents, notarized and official, filled with legal language that reduced 7 years of marriage to a series of whereas clauses and party of the first part, designations. Every signature line was already filled except one, Mitchell's signature. Bernard's signature as witness. Even Vanessa and Trevor had signed, as though dissolving a marriage required family consensus, as though Alina's life was something they could vote on and overturn. "We've been discussing this as a family," Constance said, her voice carrying across the restaurant's manufactured ambiance. The diners had stopped pretending not to listen. A woman at the next table held her fork, suspended halfway to her mouth. A young girl near the window had tears in her eyes, and Alina wanted to tell her not to cry, that some people didn't deserve your tears. But her throat had closed around words that felt too heavy to speak. Constance's speech was practiced, each word landing like a stone in still water. She listed Alina's failures with the precision of an accountant balancing books. The inability to give them grandchildren, never mind the 3 times Alina's body had tried and failed. Never mind that she'd woken up in a hospital bed alone because Mitchell had a work dinner he couldn't miss. The failure to elevate herself, whatever that meant, as though Alina hadn't turned down job offers and opportunities because Mitchell said his career needed her support at home. The embarrassment at social functions, which translated to Alina laughing at the wrong moments, talking to the wrong people, existing too loudly in spaces that preferred her invisible. "You've been a weight around Mitchell's neck," Constance declared, and Mitchell said nothing, did nothing. Just kept his phone steady, recording his wife's humiliation like it was content to be consumed later, shared in private family chats, laughed about during holidays Alina would no longer attend. Bernard checked his watch. Vanessa smirked. Trevor's toast finally found its target, a cheerful "to freedom" that nobody echoed because the cruelty was so complete it didn't need reinforcement. Mitchell's face was the worst part. Not angry or guilty or even conflicted, just smooth and blank, like a stranger wearing her husband's face, performing for his mother's approval the way he'd performed their entire marriage. Alina read every page of those divorce papers with meticulous care. She studied each clause, each stipulation, each division of assets that showed exactly how little they thought she deserved. The house would go to Mitchell. The savings would be split, but heavily in his favor. She would receive a small settlement, enough to make them feel generous without actually being generous. The papers even specified that she would leave with only her personal belongings, as though she'd brought nothing to the marriage but herself. As though years of her life were worth less than the furniture they'd accumulated. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know because they'd never bothered to actually see her, was that Alina had signed these exact papers weeks ago. Not these copies, the originals, in her attorney's office, in a building across town, with a woman who'd listened to her story and said, "You deserve better," like it was fact rather than opinion. Alina had filed for divorce before they'd even thought to ambush her. These papers in her hands were copies of documents already submitted to the court, already processed, already making their way through a system that would dissolve her marriage, whether the Owen family participated in the theater or not. Mitchell's lawyer had apparently failed to mention this detail. Or perhaps Mitchell hadn't asked. Perhaps he'd been so eager to perform for his family that he hadn't done the basic work of checking whether his victim was actually vulnerable. Either way, they thought they were ambushing her when really they were giving her the gift of absolute clarity about who they were and who they'd always been. Alina pulled her pen from her purse. It was nothing special, just a black ballpoint she'd bought at a drugstore, but as she clicked it open, the sound carried across the restaurant like a judge's gavel. She signed her name on every line that required it, her handwriting steady and clear. She stacked the pages neatly, creased them once down the middle, and slid them back across the table to Constance with the careful precision of someone returning something that never belonged to them in the first place. "Thank you," Alina said, and her voice didn't shake. "This is the most honest gift you've ever given me." She stood, and the chair legs scraped against polished floors, the sound sharp enough to make Vanessa flinch. She picked up her purse, checked to make sure she had her keys, and looked at Mitchell one final time. He was still holding his phone, still recording, still performing, still choosing his mother over everything else. "I hope you were worth it." "Mitchell," she said, and she meant his mother's approval. His family's acceptance, whatever it was he'd traded their marriage to obtain. "I really hope you were worth it." Then she walked toward the door. Each step felt like shedding weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Her heels clicked against marble with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that was finally her own. Behind her, the restaurant remained silent. The young girl who'd been crying was smiling now. The woman with the suspended fork nodded as Alina passed. Even the hostess held the door open with something that looked like respect. Alina walked out into night air that smelled like rain and possibility. She unlocked her car, slid into the driver's seat, and sat for a moment in the darkness, her hands on the steering wheel. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showing a woman she was just beginning to recognize. Then she started the engine and drove toward a life they didn't know existed, toward an apartment they'd never seen, toward freedom they'd given her while thinking they were giving her grief. The irony was so perfect it almost made her laugh. Almost, but Alina Queen was done laughing at things that weren't funny. She was done pretending cruelty was love, that silence was peace, that she was the problem in an equation that had never been designed for her to solve. She was done with all of it, and what the Owen family didn't know, what they couldn't imagine in their perfectly ordered world of appearances and performance, was that Alina being done with them was only the beginning of what she'd already set in motion. Chapter 2. The Foundation. They never saw. Alina drove past the turnoff to the house she'd shared with Mitchell, past the neighborhood where everyone knew her as Mrs. Owen, past the grocery store where she'd learned to shop for foods his mother approved of, and kept driving until the streetlights changed character and the buildings looked unfamiliar in the way that meant freedom rather than being lost. The apartment complex was modest, the kind of place the Owens would drive past without noticing. Alina parked in her designated spot, number 47, and sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the ordinary sounds of other people's lives filtering through open windows. Someone was cooking something with garlic. A television played the evening news. A child laughed, high and bright and unguarded. Mitchell had never been here, never knew this place existed, never thought to question where Alina went during her Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when she said she was taking cooking classes at the community center. She had taken exactly 2 cooking classes, both terrible, both taught by an elderly woman who believed paprika was dangerously exotic. After that, she'd simply driven here instead. To this apartment she'd rented under her maiden name, paid for with money she'd been carefully moving from accounts Mitchell never checked because he'd assumed she was too simple to understand finance. Inside, the apartment was small, but hers. Every piece of furniture chosen because she liked it, not because it matched some designer's vision of what wealthy people were supposed to want. The couch was deep blue instead of beige. The walls held art she'd found at estate sales, paintings by unknown artists whose work spoke to her, even though she couldn't explain why. Books filled shelves she'd assembled herself, mystery novels and poetry collections, and histories of places she'd never been, but hoped to visit now that she could go anywhere without asking permission. But the real heart of the apartment was the second bedroom, the one she'd converted into an office. Filing cabinets lined one wall, organized with color-coded labels. A desk held her laptop, 3 external hard drives, and a printer that had produced more documentation than Mitchell would believe possible. The walls were covered in certificates, each one representing something she'd accomplished while he thought she was wasting time. Alina changed out of the dress she'd worn to the restaurant, hanging it in the back of the closet where she'd never have to see it again. She pulled on comfortable clothes, made herself tea in a mug that said, "Nevertheless," she persisted, and settled at her desk to send the emails she'd written months ago, emails that had been waiting in her drafts folder for exactly this moment. The first email went to her attorney, confirming that the Owen family had played their part perfectly. The second went to the accountant who'd been helping her organize everything, letting him know the timeline was now active. The third went to a woman named Patricia Gaines, a name Mitchell wouldn't recognize, a woman with a story that would break his world in ways divorce papers never could. Alina's preparation hadn't started recently. It had begun one specific night, a night she could still feel in her bones when the weather changed. She'd been in the hospital, her body still cramping from losing another pregnancy that had never quite taken hold, staring at ceiling tiles and counting the minutes Mitchell was absent. He'd called once from the car, his mother's voice sharp in the background, giving him directions to somewhere that wasn't the hospital. He'd said he'd come as soon as he could, but there was this thing he had to do first. This appearance at his mother's charity gala that couldn't be missed because important people were expecting him. Alina had hung up without saying goodbye. A nurse had come in, a woman whose name tag read Louise Hammond, and she'd held Alina's hand without being asked. She'd said, "You deserve someone who shows up," and Alina had started crying. Not from the pain in her body, but from the recognition that she'd been accepting less than the minimum requirement for love for so long, she'd forgotten what showing up even looked like. That nurse, Louise, had given her a business card for a support group. Alina had gone, expecting to find women crying about their losses, and instead found women rebuilding their lives with the same determination others used to tear them down. She'd met Rhonda Keller there, a woman who'd worked for Mitchell's father and had stories that made Alina realize the Owen family's cruelty wasn't personal, but systematic. A pattern they repeated with everyone they deemed beneath them. Rhonda had kept records. She'd been Bernard's secretary for years, privy to conversations he thought she was too enamored to understand or too compromised to repeat. She had recordings of Bernard discussing how to avoid paying contractors, how to manipulate financial statements to secure loans, how to present one version of reality to banks and another to tax authorities. She'd kept everything because she knew someday she'd need leverage, and when Alina told her story, Rhonda had said, "I've been waiting for someone strong enough to use this." Through Rhonda, Alina had met others. Imani Foster, who'd been engaged to Trevor until the family decided she wasn't suitable, which meant she'd asked too many questions about money disappearing from accounts. Yolanda Hart, who'd been Vanessa's college roommate and had taken blame for cheating to protect her friend, only to be abandoned the moment she was no longer useful. Each woman carried damage the Owens had inflicted casually, thoughtlessly, the way some people littered without considering who'd have to clean up the mess. But these women hadn't come together for revenge. They'd come together because they'd each been made invisible by powerful people who never imagined that invisible people could still see, could still document, could still act. They'd shared information like women had shared information for centuries, quietly and carefully, building networks that men never noticed because men had stopped looking at them. Alina had learned that Mitchell wasn't just unfaithful, but systematically so, that his mother had been introducing him to appropriate women at events Alina was conveniently excluded from. She'd learned that Constance had been paying for hotel rooms, that family money had funded Mitchell's betrayals, that her marriage had been failing, with an audience she'd never known existed. What broke Alina wasn't discovering the affairs. It was finding a letter Mitchell had written to his mother, a letter she'd discovered tucked in a book he'd been reading, used as a bookmark and forgotten. The letter was dated from their anniversary, and in it, Mitchell described staying married to Alina as strategic. Patience explained that he was building his career foundation before moving on to someone more compatible with our family's position. He'd written about Alina, like she was an internship that looked good on a resume but wasn't meant to be permanent. Reading that letter, Alina had understood that she'd never been a wife. She'd been a placeholder, a practice run, someone Mitchell kept around until his mother approved someone better, and that understanding had crystallized into something harder than diamond: determination. She'd stayed, not because she was weak, but because leaving immediately would have meant leaving with nothing but her pain. Instead, she'd started building. She'd gone back to school online while Mitchell assumed she was watching television. She'd earned certifications in financial planning and real estate while he made jokes about her shopping habits. She'd built a client base among women who needed someone who understood what it meant to be financially vulnerable in a marriage, who needed help protecting themselves before everything fell apart. Her company existed, legally registered, fully operational. Green Consulting specialized in divorce preparation, helping women document assets, secure separate accounts, understand their legal rights before filing papers. She had clients who trusted her because she understood their fear, who paid her because she delivered results, who recommended her to friends because she'd given them the tools to leave marriages that were killing them slowly. Alina had many clients. Each one had left her marriage with her dignity intact and her assets protected. Each one had learned to see financial abuse before it became obvious, to document gaslighting before she questioned her own sanity, to build an exit strategy while still appearing compliant. Alina taught them what she'd learned, that the best revenge wasn't destruction, but reconstruction, that leaving well was better than leaving dramatically, that freedom had to be planned for, with the same care others used to build cages. Tonight, sitting in her apartment that Mitchell didn't know existed, using money she'd earned through work he'd never bothered to ask about, Alina opened her laptop and began the next phase. She'd already filed for divorce. She'd already secured her assets. She'd already built a life separate from the Owens. Now it was time to stop protecting them from themselves. She logged into her blog, the one she'd been writing for months under a pseudonym, and changed one setting from private to public. The blog was titled "The Gift of Being Underestimated," and it chronicled her marriage without using names, but with enough specific details that anyone who knew the Owens would recognize them instantly. She'd written about the restaurant, about the divorce papers presented as a birthday gift, about a family so invested in cruelty they'd filmed it for their entertainment. But she'd also written about resilience, about women who'd survived worse and built better, about the difference between being broken and breaking free. She'd written about Louise the nurse, who'd shown her kindness, about Rhonda, who'd shown her documentation, about all the women who'd shown her that survival wasn't weakness, but strategy. She hit publish. Then she opened her email and sent one final message, this one to Patricia Gaines, the woman Mitchell had gotten pregnant in high school, the woman Constance had paid to disappear. The email was simple. "It's time. Are you ready?" The response came back within minutes. "I've been ready for years." Alina closed her laptop and looked around her apartment, this small space that represented everything she'd built while the Owens had assumed she was doing nothing. Tomorrow the blog would start circulating. Tomorrow, Mitchell would discover that the wife he'd underestimated had been 3 steps ahead for years. Tomorrow, everything would change, but tonight Alina made herself dinner in her tiny kitchen. She ate slowly, tasting the food instead of swallowing it without noticing. She washed her dishes by hand instead of loading them in a dishwasher. She took a bath in water as hot as she could stand, letting it loosen muscles that had been tense for so long she'd forgotten what relaxed felt like. And when she finally went to bed in sheets she'd chosen, in a room Mitchell had never entered, Alina slept deeply and without dreams. The sleep of someone who'd finally stopped carrying weight that was never hers to bear. The storm was coming, but Alina had built an ark while they'd been laughing at rain. Chapter 3. The Empire of Overlooked Details. Mitchell woke to multiple missed calls and a text from Trevor that said, "You need to see this now," in all capitals, which his brother only used when something had gone catastrophically wrong. His first thought was that Alina had done something dramatic, maybe posted crying videos on social media or sent angry emails to his colleagues. His second thought was relief that she'd finally shown her true colors, that his family would see he'd been right to end things. Neither thought survived the next 5 minutes. The blog post was everywhere, not just on social media, but screenshotted and shared, discussed on morning news shows, dissected by relationship podcasters, turned into memes by people who'd never met Alina, but recognized the dynamics she described. The title alone was being quoted, "The Gift of Being Underestimated," and while she'd never used names, she'd used details, specific enough that everyone in their social circle knew exactly who she was writing about. Mitchell read the post on his phone, standing in his kitchen in yesterday's clothes, and each paragraph felt like watching himself from outside his body. She'd described the restaurant, the divorce papers, his mother's speech, but she'd also gone deeper, describing years of small cruelties he'd participated in without thinking. The times he'd excluded her from conversations at his own dinner table, the way he'd started sentences with "Alina thinks," and ended them with laughter that made her thoughts punchlines. The Christmas, when his mother had given everyone thoughtful gifts except Alina, who'd received a diet book, and Mitchell had said nothing because saying something would have meant choosing his wife over his mother's approval. But the blog wasn't angry. That's what made it devastating. Alina had written with the calm observation of someone documenting a natural disaster from safe distance. She described her marriage like a researcher describing a failed experiment, noting what went wrong without assigning blame, simply stating facts that anyone could verify. She'd written about women who'd helped her rebuild, about learning that she deserved better, About the moment she'd realized that the opinion of people who didn't respect her was worthless. The post ended with resources: legal aid websites for women leaving abusive marriages, financial planning guides for economic independence, therapeutic services for recovering from emotional manipulation. She turned her pain into something useful for strangers, and the comment section was full of women sharing their own stories, thanking her for putting words to experiences they'd thought were uniquely theirs. Mitchell's phone rang. His mother, of course. Her voice came through sharp and panicked. "Tell me this isn't what I think it is. Tell me your wife didn't just humiliate us publicly. She's not my wife anymore," Mitchell said, though he wasn't sure when exactly that had happened. Whether signing papers made it real, or whether the marriage had ended long before anyone acknowledged it. "Fix this," Constance demanded. "Call your lawyer. Sue her for defamation. Make her take it down." Mitchell's lawyer called him before he could call his lawyer. The conversation was brief and devastating. Nothing in the blog post was defamatory, because it was all demonstrably true. Filing suit would only confirm the story and amplify the attention. The best strategy was silence and hoping the internet moved on to the next scandal, but the internet wasn't moving on. A video had surfaced, recorded by someone at the restaurant, showing the Owen family from a different angle than Mitchell's phone had captured. This video showed the faces of other diners, their horror and disgust. It showed a young girl crying at a nearby table. It showed the restaurant manager approaching Constance afterward and quietly asking them to leave. It showed Mitchell pocketing his phone with a smile, pleased with himself for documenting his wife's destruction. That video was circulating with hashtags Mitchell didn't understand, but knew were bad. His colleagues were texting him, awkward messages that asked if he was okay, while making it clear they were distancing themselves. His country club sent an email about membership conduct standards. Even his barber texted to cancel his standing appointment without explanation. Trevor showed up at Mitchell's house unannounced, looking worse than Mitchell felt. "We need to talk about money," Trevor said, and Mitchell realized his brother wasn't there out of concern but necessity. They sat in the living room that suddenly felt too large, too empty without Alina's presence filling spaces Mitchell hadn't noticed she occupied. Trevor pulled out his laptop and showed Mitchell spreadsheets that made no sense until they made too much sense. Alina had been withdrawing money from their joint accounts for years. Not stealing, Trevor emphasized, but legally transferring her share according to the prenuptial agreement their mother had insisted on. The agreement that was supposed to protect Mitchell actually protected both of them equally, because the lawyer who'd drafted it had been hired by Alina's father, and Alina had read every word while Mitchell had signed without looking. The house wasn't solely Mitchell's, it was jointly owned, purchased with Alina's inheritance from her grandmother, a detail Mitchell had forgotten because he'd stopped listening whenever Alina talked about her family. She was entitled to half its value, and given the renovations she'd paid for and he'd approved without checking who was paying, she might be entitled to more than half. Worse than the money was what Trevor had discovered while investigating. Alina had been documenting everything. Bank statements showing Mitchell's spending on hotels and gifts for other women. Credit card receipts from restaurants where he'd taken people who weren't his wife. Phone records showing calls to numbers he couldn't explain. She had evidence of his affairs organized chronologically, notarized by someone who'd witnessed him with other women. Testimony from waiters who'd served him romantic dinners while his wife waited at home. In their state, infidelity mattered. The prenuptial agreement had a clause about fidelity, another detail Mitchell had ignored, and Alina's documentation meant she could argue for a larger share of marital assets. She could take the house. She could take his retirement accounts. She could take anything she wanted, because Mitchell had handed her ammunition by being careless enough to think she'd never use it. "How did we miss this?" Mitchell asked, and Trevor had no answer, except the obvious one. They'd underestimated her so completely, they'd stopped paying attention. Mitchell drove to the house he'd shared with Alina, expecting to find it empty, and instead found it transformed. Everything was staged perfectly, professionally photographed, and listed for sale at a price that would net Alina substantial profit. The furniture they'd bought together was gone, replaced with rental pieces that made the rooms look larger and more appealing. The walls had been repainted neutral colors that erased any sign that people had lived there. But the worst part was the mantel. Their wedding photo still sat there, but Alina's face had been carefully cut out and replaced with a mirror. Anyone looking at the photo saw themselves standing next to Mitchell in a moment that was supposed to mean forever. The message was clear. She'd been a placeholder in her own marriage, interchangeable, forgettable. Someone Mitchell had stood beside without actually seeing. Mitchell picked up the photo and saw his own reflection where his wife's face should be. And something in him finally cracked. Not guilt exactly, not yet, but the beginning of understanding that he'd lost something irreplaceable because he'd never bothered to know what he had. His phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged him in a post. Against his better judgment, he looked. It was a think piece from a major news outlet using his blog post situation as an example of casual cruelty in modern relationships. The article quoted relationship experts and psychologists, all agreeing that public humiliation as entertainment represented a concerning trend, that filming vulnerable moments without consent was a violation, that families who conspired to hurt their own members were engaging in psychological abuse. Mitchell's name wasn't used, but his face was recognizable from the video making rounds. Strangers were commenting on his character, his choices, his entire existence reduced to a cautionary tale about men who value their mother's approval more than their wife's humanity. He tried calling Alina. Her number was disconnected. He tried emailing. The address bounced back. He tried reaching out to her friends, only to discover he didn't actually know who her friends were. Couldn't name a single person she'd been close to. Had no idea who she'd spent time with or what she'd done when he wasn't paying attention. Mitchell realized with sickening clarity that he'd been married to someone he'd never bothered knowing. He'd lived with a stranger for years, eaten meals across from her, slept beside her, and never once asked what she wanted or feared or dreamed about. He'd seen her as an extension of himself rather than a person with her own interior life. And now that she was gone, he couldn't even picture her clearly, and couldn't remember the sound of her laugh before he'd trained her to stop laughing. Couldn't recall what her face looked like when she smiled genuinely instead of performing for his family. The house felt haunted by an absence that was somehow louder than presence had been. Mitchell walked through rooms that echoed, opened closets that held empty hangers, found drawers that contained nothing but the faint smell of perfume she'd worn when they first met. Before he'd told her his mother preferred subtler scents, he found himself standing in what had been Alina's bathroom. The one she'd used when he'd started claiming the master suite was too crowded for two people's morning routines. Her medicine cabinet was empty, except for one item, a pregnancy test, negative, dated from shortly before her last miscarriage. There was a post-it note attached in her handwriting. I was hoping this time would be different. You were at your mother's house choosing paint colors for her guest room. I sat on this bathroom floor alone and realized different wasn't going to happen. Mitchell sat on that same bathroom floor, holding a pregnancy test his wife had saved as evidence of a moment he didn't remember because he hadn't been there, and understood that Alina had been grieving their marriage long before she'd left it. She'd been saying goodbye for years, while he'd been too busy performing for his family to notice she was already gone. His phone buzzed again. Another notification. The blog post had been shared by a popular television host who'd experienced her own public divorce. The attention was snowballing, and Mitchell was at the center of a cultural conversation about emotional abuse, family dynamics, and what it meant to weaponize intimacy. But sitting on that bathroom floor, holding evidence of a pregnancy that never was and a marriage that never could be, Mitchell understood something that terrified him. Alina hadn't just left him. She'd stopped needing him to leave, had built an entire life he knew nothing about, had become someone he'd never bothered meeting, and now that she was free, he was the one trapped in the ruins of something he'd helped destroy, holding pieces of a life he'd never valued until it was too late to matter. Chapter 4. The Network of Invisible Allies. Alina sat in a private dining room at a restaurant. Mitchell would never think to look for her. A place that served food his family would have dismissed as too ethnic or too casual. A place where she could exist without performing. 7 other women surrounded the table, and while they ranged in appearance and background, they shared something deeper than surface similarities. They'd all been made invisible by the Owen family. Rhonda Keller arrived first, as she always did, punctual in the way of women who'd learned that being early meant being prepared. She'd worked for Bernard Owen as his secretary, but that title had been convenient fiction for what she'd actually been: his mistress, his confidant, his partner in ways that mattered professionally while being utterly disposable personally. She'd kept him organized, managed his calendar, learned his patterns, and somehow still believed he'd leave Constance until the day he'd called her into his office to introduce his new secretary, someone younger and more impressed by power, someone who hadn't yet learned that Bernard's promises expired with his interest. Rhonda hadn't cried or screamed. She'd simply started keeping copies of things she wasn't supposed to copy, recording conversations she wasn't supposed to record, documenting Bernard's business practices in case she ever needed leverage. She'd never planned to use any of it until she'd met Alina at that support group, until she'd heard her story and recognized the pattern, until she'd understood that the Owen family's cruelty wasn't personal, but systematic. A feature rather than a bug. "I brought the recordings from last quarter," Rhonda said, sliding a flash drive across the table. "Bernard's been discussing the Henderson merger. The things he's saying about inflating asset values would interest certain regulatory people." Imani Foster came next, still carrying the confidence of someone who'd almost married into the family before they'd deemed her unsuitable. Trevor had proposed with his grandmother's ring, had talked about forever and children and building a life together, right up until Imani had asked questions about money disappearing from accounts, about charges on credit cards he'd said were for business but showed up at casinos. She'd asked out of concern, trying to help him, trying to be the partner he'd claimed to want. Trevor had responded by having his mother call her to explain that their family required a certain level of discretion about financial matters, that asking questions demonstrated she wasn't sophisticated enough to understand how wealth worked. The engagement had ended with Constance offering Imani money to sign a non-disclosure agreement about Trevor's gambling, about the family's willingness to cover his debts, about their habit of presenting one face to the world while hiding rot underneath. Imani had taken the money because she'd needed it, but she'd kept copies of everything they'd wanted her to forget, betting that someday their need for secrecy would matter more than her need for cash. "Trevor's in deeper than they know," Imani reported. "I still have friends at his firm. He's been borrowing against company assets to cover gambling debts. When the auditors figure it out, it won't just be his career that ends." Louise Hammond had been the nurse who'd held Alina's hand in the hospital, but before that, she'd been a freelance accountant who'd worked for the Owen family's business. She'd noticed discrepancies, numbers that didn't reconcile, values that shifted depending on who was asking. She'd raised concerns quietly and professionally, only to be dismissed as someone who didn't understand complex financial structures. When she'd persisted, she'd been let go without explanation and found that every reference check ended with vague insinuations about her competence. Louise had reported the irregularities to authorities, but her complaints had gone nowhere because she was one woman making accusations against a powerful family, and her evidence looked suspicious rather than damning to people who didn't want to investigate. She'd eventually stopped pushing and gone into nursing instead. But she'd kept every spreadsheet, every email, Every document that showed exactly how the Owen family manipulated numbers to present different realities to banks and tax agencies. "The statute of limitations hasn't run out," Louise said. "If someone were to refile these complaints now, while they're facing public scrutiny, authorities might actually look this time." But the other 4 women at the table represented something darker, evidence of damage that went beyond professional betrayal into territory that made Mitchell's cheating seem almost mundane by comparison. Patricia Gaines sat directly across from Alina, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. She'd been Mitchell's first girlfriend, the one he'd dated in high school, the one who'd gotten pregnant when they were both too young to understand consequences fully. Mitchell had been terrified, had told his mother, and Constance had solved the problem the way she solved all problems, with money and lawyers and absolute certainty that she knew what was best for everyone involved. Patricia had been a teenage girl, scared and alone, when Constance had shown up with an attorney and papers that said if Patricia kept the baby, she'd receive a one-time payment and Mitchell would sign away all rights and responsibilities. If she gave the baby up for adoption, the payment would be larger and include college tuition. If she told anyone about the pregnancy or tried to contact Mitchell again, she'd be sued for everything she'd ever have. Patricia had kept the baby. Jordan was in high school now, brilliant and stubborn, and determined to be nothing like the father she'd never met. Patricia had raised her alone, working multiple jobs, accepting help from her family when she'd rather have died than admit she needed it. She'd built a good life for her daughter, despite Constance's belief that poor single mothers were inherently tragic figures. What she hadn't told anyone, what she'd kept secret even from Jordan, was that Mitchell's signature on those papers was forged, that he'd never actually signed away his rights because he'd never been given the chance, that Constance had simply hired someone to sign his name and had counted on Patricia being too young and scared to verify. "Jordan needs to know her medical history," Patricia said quietly. "She's having some health concerns, and the doctors keep asking about her father's family. I can't keep lying." Keisha Price was next, a woman who'd worked as the Owen family's housekeeper for years before Constance had accused her of stealing jewelry that later turned up in Vanessa's closet during spring cleaning. No apology had been issued, no admission of mistake. Keisha had simply been fired without severance and had found that every subsequent employer who called for references received careful insinuations about trustworthiness. She'd lost her house, her savings, her reputation, all because Constance had needed to blame someone for her own carelessness and had chosen the person with the least power to fight back. "I kept a journal," Keisha said. "Every conversation I overheard while I was cleaning rooms, they didn't think I was smart enough to listen in. Every phone call Bernard took while I was vacuuming. Every argument Mitchell and Alina had while I was changing their sheets. I wrote it all down because my mother always said that powerful people think housekeepers are furniture, but furniture remembers everything. Yolanda Hart had been Vanessa's college roommate, her best friend, someone she'd trusted completely until Vanessa had been caught plagiarizing a major paper. The professor had been ready to expel her, to contact other schools, to end her academic career before it started. Vanessa had cried and begged, had promised to do better, and then she'd asked Yolanda for help that turned into something else entirely. She'd needed Yolanda to say she'd written the paper, that Vanessa had used it by accident, that the plagiarism was Yolanda's fault. Yolanda had been scholarship student who couldn't afford to lose Vanessa's friendship, couldn't afford to lose the network Vanessa provided, couldn't afford to say no when Vanessa's mother called and offered to pay for Yolanda's education if she'd just take responsibility for one mistake. Yolanda had been expelled. Vanessa had graduated with honors. And years later, when Yolanda had needed a reference for a job, Vanessa had ghosted her completely, had blocked her number, had pretended they'd never known each other. I still have the original paper, Yolanda said. The one Vanessa copied. The one with her handwriting in the margins. The one that proves she didn't accidentally use my work, but deliberately stole it. The seventh woman was someone Mitchell would recognize if he ever looked past his own reflection. Her name was Angela Rivera, and she'd been dining at the restaurant the night of Alina's birthday, sitting 3 tables away with her husband and children. She'd watched the entire scene unfold, had seen her daughter start crying because the girl thought she was watching someone's birthday celebration turn mean, had seen other diners look away in embarrassment while the Owen family performed their cruelty like it was entertainment. Angela was a television producer for a regional news program that investigated stories other outlets ignored. Stories about powerful families who operated without accountability. Stories about systemic abuse disguised as personal conflict. She'd been looking for her next investigation when the universe had handed her the Owen family on a silver platter. We're running the story next week, Angela said. Not tabloid stuff, real journalism. Interviewing former employees, clients who felt cheated, women who were paid to disappear. We're calling it The Cost of Appearances, one family's pattern of abuse. Alina looked around the table at these women, each one carrying damage the Owen family had inflicted without thinking twice, and felt something she hadn't expected, not satisfaction or triumph, but sadness that so many people had been hurt by one family's belief that their comfort mattered more than other people's dignity. I didn't bring you together for revenge, Alina said, and she meant it. I brought you together because you deserve to be heard, to be believed, to know you weren't crazy or weak or wrong. You were hurt by people who thought they were too powerful to face consequences. So what now? Patricia asked. Do we just tell our stories and hope it matters? We tell our stories because they're ours to tell, Alina answered. What happens after that isn't up to us. But at least nobody can say we stayed silent. They talked for hours, sharing details and evidence, crying sometimes, but laughing more often, finding dark humor in the Owen family's absolute conviction that they were untouchable. They ordered too much food and left generous tips because they'd all worked service jobs at some point and knew what it meant when customers actually saw you as human. When they finally left, walking out into evening air that smelled like possibility, Alina realized they weren't victims gathering to lick their wounds. They were women who'd survived, who'd built lives after destruction, who'd chosen to speak up not because they needed validation, but because their silence had been purchased and they were taking it back. Mitchell would never understand that this wasn't a conspiracy against him. It was simply the natural consequence of his family leaving wreckage in their wake without ever looking back to see what they'd destroyed. Wreckage doesn't stay scattered forever. Sometimes it gathers itself into something that can push back. And the Owen family, who'd spent their lives pushing people down, had never considered what might happen when those people decided to stand up. Chapter 5. The daughter he never knew he lost. The letter arrived at Mitchell's office, hand-delivered by a courier who made him sign for it with the gravity of someone serving legal documents. Inside was correspondence from an attorney Mitchell didn't recognize, representing a client he didn't remember, making claims that cracked the foundation of everything he thought he knew about his own history. Patricia Gaines was seeking to establish paternity for a child born years ago, a daughter who carried Mitchell's DNA and Patricia's last name, and a medical situation that required knowing family history that had been deliberately obscured. The letter was clinical and professional, devoid of emotion, but the attached photograph was anything but. A girl looked directly at the camera with Mitchell's eyes and his mother's stubborn chin and an expression that said she knew more than anyone wanted her to know. Mitchell sat in his office staring at that photograph until his assistant knocked to ask if he needed anything, and he realized 2 hours had passed without him moving. He didn't need anything. He needed everything. He needed the past to be different. He needed his mother to have been someone else. He needed to not be the kind of man who had a child he'd never met, who'd signed away a daughter without knowing she existed, except he hadn't signed anything. That's what the letter explained in careful legal language. The documents his mother had shown him when he was in high school, the papers that supposedly absolved him of responsibility and obligation, had been signed by someone who wasn't him. Constance had forged his signature because actually getting him to sign would have required explaining details she'd wanted him to forget, would have given him a chance to question or refuse, would have acknowledged that he had agency in a situation she'd decided to handle herself. Mitchell drove to his mother's house without calling ahead, without preparing what he'd say, operating on fury that felt cleaner than the guilt underneath it. Constance answered the door already defensive, already prepared with justifications that crumbled when she saw his face. "You forged my signature," Mitchell said. Not a question, but an accusation that hung between them like smoke. "You signed away my daughter without telling me I had a daughter to sign away." Constance didn't deny it. She simply pivoted to explanation, to rationalization, to the belief that she'd done what was necessary. Patricia had been unsuitable. Mitchell had been too young. The pregnancy had been a mistake that would have derailed his entire future. She'd handled it the way mothers handled things, by making difficult decisions so their children didn't have to. "You took my choice," Mitchell said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, younger and older simultaneously. "You decided I wasn't capable of being a father, and you made sure I'd never get the chance." "You weren't capable," Constance replied, and she believed it, believed that teenage Mitchell would have made the wrong choice, believed that her judgment mattered more than his agency, believed that motherhood meant controlling outcomes rather than supporting decisions. "You would have stayed with that girl out of obligation. You would have thrown away your potential for someone who trapped you with a pregnancy." "She didn't trap me," Mitchell said, though he barely remembered Patricia now, could hardly conjure her face from memories that had been deliberately buried. "We were both there. We both made choices, and you made sure I never had to face any of them." He left without slamming the door, without the dramatic exit that would have given his mother something to react to. He simply walked away from her mid-sentence, from her justifications, from her absolute conviction that she'd been right. The hospital where Jordan was being treated was 40 minutes away, far enough that Mitchell had time to construct and discard a dozen versions of what he'd say when he got there. But all his prepared speeches evaporated when he saw Patricia in the waiting room, aged by hard work and harder choices, looking at him with an expression that held no anger or hope, just weary assessment of whether he'd come to help or to hurt. "You didn't have to come," Patricia said. Though the attorney's letter had made it clear that Mitchell's presence was necessary, that medical history mattered, that Jordan's health concerns required knowing what genetics she'd inherited from a father she'd never met. "I didn't know," Mitchell started, but Patricia cut him off with a raised hand. "You didn't want to know," she corrected. "Your mother offered you a solution, and you took it because not knowing was easier than knowing. Don't pretend you were some victim in this. You were in high school, not elementary school. You knew what you were choosing when you chose nothing." She was right. And Mitchell had no defense except the truth that he'd been a coward, that he'd let his mother make his decisions because taking responsibility would have required becoming someone he wasn't ready to be, someone he'd spent his entire life avoiding becoming. Jordan was in a private room, sitting up in bed with homework spread across a tray table, working on assignments because missing school was apparently worse than being in the hospital. She looked up when Mitchell entered, and her expression went from curiosity to understanding to something harder in the space of 3 heartbeats. "So you're him," she said, not standing or offering her hand or doing any of the things people did when meeting for the first time. "My mom said you'd probably come because you needed something from me, not because you wanted to know me." Mitchell opened his mouth to deny it, to explain, to somehow make this girl understand that he hadn't known she existed. But she was already talking again, already dismantling every excuse he hadn't finished formulating. "She told me the whole story," Jordan continued, marking her place in a textbook with careful precision. "How your mother paid her to go away. How she kept me anyway because she wanted me even if you didn't. How she worked multiple jobs so I could have what I needed. How every birthday when I'd ask about you, she'd tell me that some people aren't built for parenthood, and that's okay, because the people who are built for it matter more." "I would have wanted to know you," Mitchell said. And it sounded hollow even to him, because wanting wasn't the same as choosing. And he'd spent his whole life wanting things without ever fighting for them. "Would you?" Jordan asked, and her skepticism was so complete it didn't even sound angry, just tired. "Or would you have wanted to want me? Because those are different things. My mom wanted me. She chose me every single day, even when it was hard. You didn't even choose to find out if I existed." Patricia had taught this girl to see clearly, to understand that people's actions revealed their priorities better than their words ever could. Jordan had been raised by a woman who'd turned Constance's money into a college fund, who'd built a life from nothing and taught her daughter that being unwanted by some people just meant you were wanted more fiercely by the right ones. "The doctors need medical history," Patricia interjected, sparing Mitchell from having to respond to truths he couldn't refute. "Your family's health background. Heart conditions, cancers, genetic disorders. Jordan's having some concerning symptoms, and they need to know what to look for." Mitchell provided what information he could, though he realized how little he actually knew about his own family's medical history. The Owens didn't discuss weakness or vulnerability. They didn't acknowledge that bodies failed, or that genetics were lottery nobody controlled. His grandmother had died from something Constance only ever referred to as complications, as though naming the illness would make it more real. The medical team took blood for testing to see if Mitchell was a match for what Jordan might need. And while they waited for results, Mitchell sat in the waiting room with Patricia in silence that felt louder than conversation. "Alina helped us find you," Patricia finally said. "She reached out months ago, asked if I'd ever gotten the support I was owed, if I'd ever told Jordan about her father. When I explained what had happened, she connected me with an attorney who took the case for free. She paid for Jordan's current treatment anonymously because she said a child's health mattered more than family drama." Mitchell absorbed this information slowly, understanding that his ex-wife had been helping his daughter while he'd been helping himself to his mother's approval, that Alina had seen a need and filled it without waiting for permission or recognition, that she'd been more of a parent to Jordan in a few months than he'd been in a lifetime. The test results came back negative. Mitchell wasn't a match for what Jordan needed, and the relief he felt was shameful but honest. He couldn't fix this. He couldn't be the solution. He could only be what he'd always been, someone present in body but absent in all the ways that mattered. But the publicity from his paternity case brought forward other potential donors. The story of Mitchell Owen's secret daughter spread through local news, and while most coverage was sympathetic to Patricia and Jordan, Mitchell's role was presented exactly as it had been, absent by choice, present only when forced by circumstance. Jordan got her transplant from a stranger who'd seen the news coverage and gotten tested on impulse. Someone who'd never met her but wanted to help anyway. The surgery went well. The prognosis was good. Patricia sent Mitchell updates out of courtesy, not connection. Brief texts that treated him like a distant relative rather than Jordan's father. Mitchell tried visiting again after Jordan recovered, bringing gifts that felt like apologies wrapped in paper and ribbon. Jordan accepted them politely and put them aside unopened. And when he asked if they could have a relationship, if he could be part of her life going forward, she looked at him with the devastating honesty of someone too young to know that some truths were supposed to stay hidden. "Why would I want a relationship with you?" Jordan asked. "You weren't here when it mattered. You're here now because you feel guilty, and guilt isn't love. My mom taught me that. She said the hardest thing she ever did was keep me when everyone said she shouldn't, and the easiest thing was loving me once I was here. You had the same chance. You just made different choices. Patricia walked Mitchell out afterward, and on the hospital steps where spring sunlight made everything look deceptively hopeful, she told him something that would stay with him longer than anything else. I don't hate you, Mitchell. I don't think about you enough to hate you. But I need you to understand that Jordan doesn't need a father. She has everything she needs. If you want to be in her life, it has to be because you genuinely care about her, not because you're trying to fix your guilt or your reputation or whatever it is you're actually trying to fix. And right now, I don't think you know the difference. Mitchell drove away from the hospital, understanding that he'd lost a daughter he'd never had, that some absences were so complete they couldn't be filled retroactively, that showing up late was sometimes worse than not showing up at all, because it forced everyone to acknowledge the gap where you should have been. He'd spent his life choosing his mother's approval over everyone else's need, and the cost of that choice was standing on hospital steps telling him she didn't need him, had never needed him, had built a beautiful life in his absence that his presence could only diminish. The irony was crushing. He'd discovered he had a daughter the same week he'd lost his wife, and both losses were evidence of the same pattern, the same fundamental failure to see people as more than supporting characters in a story where he was always the protagonist who mattered most. Chapter 6. The Mirror. They refused to see. Mitchell's assistant quit on a Tuesday morning without ceremony or explanation, handing him a letter that used professional language to describe unprofessional feelings. She thanked him for the opportunity, wished him well in future endeavors, and left her desk cleared so completely it looked like she'd never existed there at all. Mitchell read the letter twice, looking for clues about what he'd done wrong, and found nothing except the signature of someone who'd decided he wasn't worth explaining herself. So the truth was buried in her resignation email, sent after hours to HR but not to Mitchell, laying out years of watching him dismiss and belittle Alina in front of colleagues. She'd documented times he'd made jokes about his wife's intelligence during client meetings, moments when he'd brought other women to company events while Alina waited at home, instances when he'd asked his assistant to lie to Alina about his whereabouts. The email was professional and devastating, and HR forwarded it to Mitchell with a note that said they'd be conducting interviews about workplace culture and expected his full cooperation. His colleagues started treating him differently, with a distance that wasn't quite hostile but definitely wasn't friendly. The easy camaraderie of shared lunches disappeared. The invitations to after-work drinks stopped coming. Mitchell would walk into a room, and conversations would pause, restart on different topics, leave him standing in social spaces that suddenly had no room for him. He didn't understand what had changed until he overheard two junior associates talking by the coffee machine, their voices low, but not low enough. They were discussing the blog post, the video, the pattern of behavior that Mitchell had displayed publicly and apparently privately. One of them mentioned that his assistant had told friends about watching Mitchell treat his wife like an embarrassment while treating his affairs like accomplishments. And that kind of behavior reflected on everyone in the office. Mitchell's favorite restaurant, the place where waiters had known his name and his usual order, suddenly couldn't find his reservation despite him calling that morning to confirm. The hostess apologized with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and suggested he try somewhere else. He recognized one of the waiters, someone who'd served him dozens of times, and the man looked through him like he was transparent. It wasn't until Mitchell called to complain, to demand to speak with a manager, that someone finally told him the truth. Alina had been the one who tipped well, who remembered staff names, who asked about their lives, and actually listened to answers. Mitchell had been tolerated because of her, welcomed because she'd built goodwill that extended to her husband by association. Without her, he was just another demanding customer who'd filmed his wife's humiliation and thought it was entertainment. His dry cleaner lost 3 of his shirts. His barber cancelled his standing appointment. His usual parking spot at the gym was suddenly always taken. Small inconveniences that individually meant nothing but collectively signaled that the infrastructure of his life was collapsing in ways he couldn't quite identify. Until he realized that Alina had been maintaining all of it. She'd been the one who built relationships with service workers, who treated them like humans rather than functions. She'd remembered birthdays and asked after sick children and left cards when staff members graduated or got married or had babies. She'd created a web of goodwill that Mitchell had lived inside without ever acknowledging. And now that web was gone, and he was experiencing the world as it actually saw him, a man who recorded his wife's destruction for entertainment, a man who valued his mother's approval more than his marriage, a man whose cruelty had finally found an audience who wasn't entertained. The video from the restaurant continued circulating, picked up by sites that discussed toxic family dynamics and emotional abuse. Someone had edited it with text overlays pointing out specific behaviors. Mitchell's smile while his mother spoke, the way he'd positioned his phone for the best angle, the moment Alina's hands had gone still before she'd signed the papers. The video had become a teaching tool about recognizing abuse, about understanding that cruelty didn't require screaming or violence, that some of the worst damage was done quietly by people who thought they were being clever. Mitchell's college sent an email asking him not to attend the upcoming reunion as keynote speaker, a position he'd been offered before everything fell apart. They cited the need to foster an inclusive environment and thanked him for understanding, though he didn't understand anything except that consequences had finally found him in spaces where his family name used to provide protection. Trevor called in the middle of the night, drunk and panicking, saying they needed to talk about money immediately. Mitchell drove to his brother's house and found him surrounded by papers and empty bottles, trying to calculate how much damage had been done and coming up with numbers that made no sense until they made too much sense. The family business was hemorrhaging clients, not because anyone was actively sabotaging them, but because the people they'd been overcharging and under-delivering to for years had finally been given permission to leave by watching the Owen family's private cruelty become public knowledge. If they could treat family members that way, clients reasoned, how were they treating business partners when nobody was watching? But worse than losing clients was the revelation that Trevor had been embezzling, covering gambling debts by borrowing against company assets, creating financial holes he'd been planning to fill before anyone noticed. Except now everyone was noticing everything, and auditors were asking questions Trevor couldn't answer without admitting to crimes that carried prison sentences. "We're going to lose everything," Trevor said, and he meant it. The business would fold, the reputation would dissolve, the family name would become a warning rather than a credential. Everything Bernard had built, everything Constance had protected, everything the Owen children had inherited would evaporate because they'd been so focused on maintaining appearances that they'd never bothered building substance underneath. Mitchell's sister, Vanessa, lost custody of her children in a hearing that should have been routine but became revelatory when her ex-husband submitted evidence that Constance had helped him collect. Recordings of Vanessa teaching their son to lie about his mother to teachers, coaching him in manipulation, punishing displays of genuine emotion. Family court judges had seen terrible parents, but they rarely saw someone so committed to creating smaller versions of dysfunction, to passing down cruelty like it was inheritance rather than infection. Bernard had a stroke at his desk, surrounded by legal documents he'd been trying to organize for the investigations that were now inevitable. The stroke wasn't severe enough to kill him, but serious enough to require care. And Constance discovered their health insurance had lapsed during all the chaos, that medical bills would consume what little savings they had left. that they would have to ask for help from children who were drowning in consequences of their own. The Owen family's mansion went into foreclosure. The vacation property sold at auction. Constance's jewelry was appraised and found to be worth a fraction of what she'd claimed. Costume pieces mixed with real ones in ways that made appraisers wonder if she'd ever known the difference, or if appearing wealthy had mattered more than being wealthy. Mitchell walked through the family home before it was seized, looking at rooms that had once represented success and now just looked like spaces where unhappy people had performed happiness for each other. He found photographs from family gatherings, everyone dressed perfectly and smiling with their mouths, while their eyes held the same exhaustion he saw in his own mirror. In his father's study, Mitchell discovered files Alina must have known about, evidence that Bernard had built his business partially on fraud committed decades ago against a partner who'd died, believing he'd failed rather than been robbed. There were letters from the partner's widow asking for help, for explanations, for anything that would make sense of why her husband's business had collapsed while Bernard's had flourished. All the letters had been ignored, filed away like they were problems that could be solved by pretending they didn't exist. Mitchell understood that his family's empire had been built on the backs of people they'd discarded, that their wealth had come from taking rather than earning, that everything they'd valued was bought with other people's dignity. And Alina had known. She'd seen it all, documented it all, and waited for the right moment to stop protecting them from themselves. His phone buzzed with a notification. Another article about the Owen family, this one from a business journal discussing them as a case study in how toxic internal culture eventually manifested externally, how companies led by people who abused their families inevitably abused their employees and clients and partners. Mitchell sat in his father's chair, surrounded by evidence of systematic cruelty disguised as success, and understood that Alina hadn't destroyed his family. She'd simply stepped aside and let them be seen clearly for the first time. She'd been the smoke and mirrors that made their act work, and without her maintaining the illusion, everyone could see that the Owens were just ordinary people who'd convinced themselves that other people's pain was the price of their comfort. His mother called, her voice smaller than he'd ever heard it, asking if he could lend her money. Mitchell almost laughed because he barely had money for himself anymore, because his accounts were being drained by legal fees and divorce settlements, and the discovery that Alina had been entitled to far more than they'd initially thought. How did this happen? Constance asked, and she genuinely didn't know, genuinely couldn't see that this had been happening all along, that Alina had just stopped preventing the inevitable, that consequences had been waiting patiently for years and had finally been invited in. "We did this," Mitchell said, and for the first time in his life, he didn't let his mother argue him into believing something else. "We treated people like they were disposable. We thought being powerful meant we didn't have to be decent. We were wrong." Constance hung up without responding, without acknowledging, without any of the things she'd demanded from everyone else for decades. Mitchell sat in the silence of his father's study and understood that his family had fallen not because Alina had pushed them, but because she'd finally stopped holding them up. Chapter 7. The Past That Rewrites the Present. The storage unit key arrived in the mail with no return address and no explanation, just a small silver key attached to a slip of paper with an address Mitchell didn't recognize. He drove there expecting a trap or a trick or some kind of dramatic revelation. But what he found was worse than any of those things. He found the truth, organized and archived, like a museum exhibit of a marriage's slow death. The storage unit was climate-controlled and meticulously arranged. Alina had created a timeline on one wall, photographs and documents pinned in chronological order, each item labeled with dates and context in her careful handwriting. Mitchell stood at the entrance, staring at years of his life presented as evidence, as data points in a case against him that he'd been building without realizing he was on trial. The timeline started with their wedding photo, both of them young and hopeful and stupidly certain that love was enough. Alina had written beneath it, "The day I married a man who looked at me like I was his whole world. I believed him." The next photo was from their honeymoon, Mitchell's arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something neither of them would remember now. Her note, "Last time I felt like his priority instead of his obligation." The photos progressed chronologically, and Mitchell could watch himself disappearing from Alina's life in increments. Holiday gatherings, where he stood with his family and she stood alone at the edges. Dinner parties, where he was deep in conversation while she sat silent beside him. Anniversary celebrations, where he was checking his phone and she was checking whether anyone noticed she was there. But the photographs were just the opening exhibit. The real devastation was in the boxes, each one labeled with a different year. Each one containing evidence Mitchell had no memory of creating because he'd never thought about what he was destroying. Letters Alina had written but never sent filled the first box. Hundreds of them, ranging from single paragraphs to pages that documented specific incidents, specific hurts, specific moments when she'd chosen to stay despite having every reason to leave. Mitchell read them in chronological order and watched his wife's hope erode with each passing month. One letter, dated from their first anniversary, described how Alina had planned a surprise dinner, and Mitchell had cancelled because his mother needed help selecting new curtains. The letter was cheerful and understanding, making excuses for him, blaming herself for not checking his schedule first. Another letter from their second anniversary had less cheer and more confusion. Why did his mother's preferences always override Alina's needs? Why did Mitchell agree to things and then forget them? Why did she feel like she was competing for attention from her own husband and losing to a woman who actively disliked her? By their third anniversary, the letters had changed tone entirely. No more questions, just observations. Mitchell had forgotten their anniversary completely that year, hadn't even apologized when Alina reminded him, had instead gotten defensive about being expected to remember everything. Her letter documented the conversation verbatim, his words preserved like insects in amber. "Why do you make such a big deal about dates? It's just a day. It's not like I forgot you exist." Except that's exactly what he'd done. He'd forgotten she existed as anything other than a wife-shaped object that was supposed to remain in place while he pursued his actual life with his actual family. And Alina had written it all down. Every forgotten promise, every casual dismissal, every time he'd chosen his mother's approval over her dignity. The second box contained recordings, audio files on a tablet she'd left for him, with instructions taped to the screen. Press play. Listen to who you became when you thought nobody was documenting it. Mitchell hesitated before following the instructions, but cowardice required more energy than he had left. So he pressed play and heard his own voice saying things he didn't remember saying. The first recording was from a family dinner. Mitchell talking to Trevor about Alina like she wasn't sitting 3 feet away. "She's been putting on weight," his voice said, casual and careless. "Mom keeps hinting I should say something, but what am I supposed to say? Hey, honey, you're getting fat." That'll go over well. Trevor's laugh, Vanessa's giggle, and underneath it all, the sound of silverware against plates that must have been Alina, continuing to eat while they discussed her body like it was public property. Another recording caught Mitchell on the phone with his mother, discussing Alina's third miscarriage. "She's taking it really hard," his voice said, sounding inconvenienced rather than concerned. "I don't know what to do with her when she gets like this. Maybe you could talk to her? Tell her it's not that big of a deal. We can try again." Constance's response was too quiet to hear, but Mitchell's laugh was clear. "Yeah, you're right. She's being dramatic. It was barely even a pregnancy." Mitchell stopped the recording, hands shaking, but Alina had left instructions on the tablet. "Keep listening. You owe me that much. You owe yourself the truth about who you've been." So he kept listening, hearing himself dismiss her pain, mock her interests, complain about her to his family like she was a burden he'd been unfairly assigned to carry. The third box contained medical records, and Mitchell wished it didn't. Alina's miscarriages were documented in clinical detail, but she'd also included her own notes about each one. The first miscarriage, she'd been alone in the emergency room for hours before Mitchell arrived, and when he got there, his first question had been whether the hospital validated parking. The second miscarriage he'd missed entirely because he'd been at a work conference and decided not to come home early since there was nothing he could do anyway. The third miscarriage, she'd called him repeatedly while bleeding and scared, and he'd been at his mother's house selecting paint colors for a guest room remodel. You phone on silent because his mother demanded undivided attention. Alina's notes weren't angry or accusatory. They simply stated facts. Called Mitchell repeatedly. No answer. Drove myself to hospital. Waited alone. Realized I would always be alone in this marriage, even when he was standing next to me. Reading that, Mitchell felt something crack inside his chest. Not guilt, but the first tremor of understanding that he'd been present for his marriage in the way furniture is present, occupying space without offering support. The fourth box contained bank statements and credit card bills, evidence of Mitchell's affairs organized chronologically, with notes identifying which woman received which gifts, which hotels were used for which encounters, how much family money had been spent funding betrayals, while Alina lived on a budget she thought they both agreed to. She documented everything, created spreadsheets, calculated that Mitchell had spent more on his affairs in 6 months than he'd spent on Alina in their entire marriage. But the final box was what broke him completely. It contained 3 videos, professionally recorded and time-stamped, Alina speaking directly to camera with the composed precision of someone providing testimony. Mitchell plugged the tablet into the wall and watched his wife explain their marriage from her perspective. And it was like seeing himself in a mirror for the first time after living his whole life, assuming his reflection matched his self-image. The first video showed Alina early in their marriage, her face softer and more hopeful than he remembered it being. She talked about loving him, about believing they could build something beautiful together despite his family's disapproval. She talked about compromises she'd made willingly, opportunities she'd turned down gladly, because she'd believed their partnership mattered more than her individual ambitions. She'd looked at the camera and said, "I love him enough to become smaller if that's what makes his family accept us." And Mitchell wanted to reach through time and tell her not to, that becoming smaller only taught people you were comfortable disappearing. The second video was dated after her third miscarriage. Alina's face had changed, something behind her eyes that hadn't been there before. She talked about staying because she believed love could survive anything if both people wanted it to, but she was starting to suspect only one person wanted it. She described the hospital room, the waiting, the drive home alone, and she said something that made Mitchell's throat close. "I think I'm grieving our marriage more than I'm grieving the pregnancy. The baby never had a chance to live. My marriage has been dying slowly for years." The third video was dated from months before the restaurant incident. Alina looked like someone who'd finished crying and reached the other side of grief, where everything felt clear and clean and final. She talked about leaving, but not the way Mitchell had imagined. She didn't sound angry or hurt. She sounded tired of being hurt, exhausted by caring about someone who would never care back, ready to trade their marriage for peace, even though peace meant being alone. "I don't love him anymore," Alina told the camera, and her voice was steady. "I don't hate him either. I just feel nothing." And maybe that's the saddest part. After all those years of loving him despite everything, of hoping he'd see me, of believing I could be enough if I just tried harder, I finally understand that the problem was never me. The problem was loving someone who confused love with ownership, partnership with convenience, marriage with having a wife-shaped placeholder in his life while he lived his real life somewhere else. She'd looked directly at the camera, directly at Mitchell watching this from the future, and said, "If you're seeing this, it means I finally left. It means I chose myself. And I need you to know that this choice wasn't about you. It was about me deciding I deserved better than a man who valued his mother's approval more than my existence. I hope you're happy, Mitchell. I genuinely do, because my happiness is no longer connected to yours, and that disconnection was the greatest gift I ever gave myself. Mitchell sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, surrounded by evidence of who he'd been and who he'd never bothered becoming, and understood that Alina had loved him until love became self-destruction, and then she'd chosen herself. She documented everything not for revenge, but for the record, so he could never rewrite history, never convince himself he'd been a good husband with a difficult wife, never forget that he'd been given something precious and had traded it for his mother's conditional approval. He found one final item in the storage unit, a folder labeled "For Mitchell" that contained divorce papers, the real ones she'd filed before his family's restaurant performance. She'd attached a note. "I filed 2 weeks before your family gave me their gift. These papers were already in the court system when you thought you were ambushing me. I let you have your moment because I wanted you to see who your family really was, wanted you to understand what you chose every single day of our marriage. I hope it was worth it." Mitchell left the storage unit, locked the door, and drove without destination through a city that looked different now that he understood he'd been seeing it wrong his entire life. He'd thought he was the protagonist of his own story, but he'd actually been the antagonist in Alina's. The obstacle she'd had to overcome to reach the life she deserved. And the worst part was that she'd given him the key to see all of this, had left him evidence of his own cruelty, and he couldn't even be angry with her for it because everything she'd documented was true. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Nobody planned. The Owen family business failed on a Thursday morning, not with drama but with paperwork. Official notices from regulatory agencies, letters from the State Attorney General's office, auditor reports that read like autopsies determining cause of death. Bernard's fraud from decades ago had been unearthed by investigators, who'd initially been looking into Trevor's embezzlement, but had discovered something older and more systematic underneath. The widow of Bernard's original partner received vindication too late for her husband to see it, but soon enough that she could finally understand why her life had fallen apart when he died. She filed civil suit with attorney fees covered by a fund that Alina had quietly established for exactly this purpose, helping people who'd been victimized by powerful families finally seek justice when the power structure shifted. Trevor entered a plea agreement that required cooperation with ongoing investigations, testimony against his father, in exchange for reduced charges. The gambling debts that had started everything turned out to be symptoms of addiction he'd been hiding for years, covering losses with company money while his family pretended they couldn't see the signs. He entered treatment at a facility that accepted payment plans because the Owen family wealth had evaporated before he could access it, and his wife filed for separation because love required trust and trust required honesty neither of them had practiced. Vanessa lost her children in a custody hearing that revealed years of emotional manipulation documented by teachers, therapists, and her ex-husband's careful recording. The judge had been harsh, noting that teaching children to weaponize emotion, to view relationships as transactions, to see vulnerability as weakness, represented the kind of psychological damage that would take years to undo. Vanessa was granted supervised visits, required therapy, and faced the reality that her children were visibly relieved to be away from her. Constance moved into a small apartment funded by emergency assistance programs, the same programs she'd once lobbied against during her charity board days because she'd believed poverty was a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. Her jewelry sold for far less than she'd hoped. Her designer clothes went to consignment shops. Her carefully maintained appearance crumbled without the infrastructure of wealth to support it. She aged rapidly once the work of appearing ageless became something she couldn't afford. Bernard survived his stroke, but emerged diminished, dependent on care he couldn't afford, and family members who'd scattered like debris from an explosion. He moved into an assisted living facility that accepted his reduced assets and provided basic care without luxury or privacy. Sometimes he'd try to talk about the old days, about business triumphs and family legacy. But the other residents had their own stories, and nobody wanted to hear his. The mansion sold at auction to a developer who planned to subdivide the property, erasing the Owen family legacy literally, turning their monument to success into foundations for other families' dreams. The vacation property became a rental managed by strangers who had no idea about the family who'd once owned it and wouldn't have cared if they'd known. But while the Owen family collapsed under the weight of their own cruelty, Elena built something that had nothing to do with their destruction and everything to do with her own competence finally being recognized. Her blog became a book deal with a publisher who specialized in memoirs about resilience. She was invited to speak at conferences about financial planning for women leaving difficult marriages. Her consulting company expanded to 3 cities, helping women protect themselves legally and financially before relationships ended, teaching them to document everything the way she'd documented everything, to build exit strategies while appearing compliant. The foundation she'd started in Jordan's name received donations from women who'd read her story and wanted to help other single mothers whose children faced medical crises without adequate support. Elena hired Patricia to run the foundation, giving her a salary that meant she could work 1 job instead of 3. Stability Jordan had never known, but that children deserved by default rather than as privilege. Elena was featured in a magazine profile titled "From Underestimated to Unstoppable," photographed in her office surrounded by certificates and awards, looking younger and more vibrant than she'd ever looked in Owen family photos. The article detailed her business growth, her speaking engagements, her foundation's impact, and mentioned her divorce only in passing as something she'd survived rather than something that defined her. She started dating someone new, a widowed architect named Daniel, who treated her with the kind of quiet respect that felt revolutionary after years of being treated like property. He asked about her day and listened to answers. He remembered small details she mentioned in passing. He cancelled his own plans when she needed support, instead of demanding she accommodate his schedule. He was ordinary in the ways Mitchell had been exceptional, and exceptional in the ways Mitchell had been ordinary. And Elena discovered that ordinary kindness was more valuable than extraordinary performance. Daniel had lost his wife to cancer, understood grief and recovery, approached relationships with the humility of someone who'd learned that love required showing up consistently rather than dramatically. He met Jordan and Patricia without needing Elena to explain the complicated dynamics, simply accepting that family was built through presence rather than biology. Jordan liked him because he asked about her interests without pretending to share them, because he listened without trying to solve her problems, because he treated her mother like she was someone worth knowing rather than someone who needed fixing. Mitchell watched all of this from a distance, through social media and news articles and the occasional update from mutual acquaintances who couldn't resist telling him how well Elena was doing. Each update felt like evidence that she'd been ready to thrive all along, had simply been waiting to escape the weight of his family's expectations and his own inadequacy. The reunion invitation arrived while Mitchell was packing up his apartment, downsizing to something he could afford now that his income had evaporated along with his family's business. The invitation was formal and elegant, embossed printing announcing that Elena Queen would be giving the keynote address at their college reunion, speaking about resilience and rebuilding and choosing yourself when everyone else chose someone else. Mitchell had committed to attending months ago, back when he'd been listed as co-keynote speaker, back when he'd thought having a prestigious career and a powerful family made him someone worth listening to. The committee had quietly removed his name from promotional materials, but the invitation still technically stood, because uninviting someone felt more dramatic than allowing them to attend anonymously. Trevor called to ask if Mitchell was really going, if subjecting himself to watching Alina's triumph while drowning in his own consequences was worth it. Mitchell didn't have a good answer except that he needed to see her one more time. Needed to say something, though he hadn't figured out what. Needed to understand how someone could emerge from their marriage looking more whole than when they'd entered it, while he felt increasingly fragmented. "She's not going there for you," Trevor warned. "She's going there for herself. You showing up will mean nothing to her." "I know," Mitchell said, and he did know. But going anyway felt like the only thing he could control in a life that had spiraled beyond his ability to manage. He spent weeks trying to figure out what he'd say if given the chance. Apologies felt inadequate. Explanations sounded like excuses. Asking for forgiveness seemed selfish when he hadn't earned the right to be forgiven. He rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Imagined scenarios where Alina would hear him out and somehow absolve him. Fantasies that required her to care about his pain when she'd spent years having her pain ignored. The reunion was approaching. Mitchell bought a suit he couldn't afford because showing up in clothes that revealed his reduced circumstances felt like admitting defeat. He practiced talking to his reflection, trying to find words that didn't sound hollow or self-serving, settling eventually on simple truth. He'd been wrong, he was sorry. He hoped she was happy because she deserved happiness he'd never provided. But the words felt empty, even as he rehearsed them, because apologizing for destroying someone's life while they were building a new one just meant interrupting their construction to remind them of ruins they'd already cleared away. Mitchell understood that his apology was for himself, that it would do nothing for Alina except remind her of time wasted on someone who'd never deserved it. Still, he was going to the reunion. Not because she needed him there, but because he needed to see what she'd become without him, needed to witness the proof that she'd been capable of extraordinary things all along, and he'd been the one holding her back. He needed to see evidence that leaving him had been the best decision she'd ever made, because maybe then he could stop trying to convince himself there was some version of their story where he'd been good enough, where his family's approval had been worth what he'd sacrificed to get it, where he was anything other than the obstacle in someone else's journey toward becoming who they were always meant to be. Chapter 9. The Reunion Where Masks Fall. The hotel ballroom was decorated with silver and blue, school colors that looked elegant against white tablecloths and crystal centerpieces. Mitchell arrived deliberately late, hoping to slip in unnoticed, but the crowd parted when he entered in that way crowds do when they'd rather not acknowledge someone but can't help noticing their presence. He found a seat at a table near the back, surrounded by people he vaguely recognized but who'd apparently decided not to recognize him. Alina entered later, and the room shifted in ways Mitchell felt rather than saw. She wore a dress the color of sunrise, coral and gold, that made her skin glow. Her hair styled differently than he remembered, shorter, and framing her face in ways that emphasized features he'd stopped noticing sometime during their marriage. But more than her appearance, her presence had changed. She moved through the crowd with easy confidence, stopping to hug people, laugh at jokes, accept compliments without the self-deprecating deflection she'd practiced during their marriage. She was surrounded by her network, the women Mitchell had only recently learned existed. Patricia and Jordan walked beside her, Jordan in a dress that made her look mature and poised, carrying herself with self-possession that reminded Mitchell painfully of opportunities he'd missed. Rhonda Keller was there, and Imani Foster, and others he recognized from news coverage of the Owen family's collapse. They weren't celebrating his destruction, but celebrating their own survival. And the distinction mattered in ways Mitchell was only beginning to understand. The evening proceeded with speeches from distinguished alumni, people who'd built careers and families and lives worth documenting. Each speaker told stories about lessons learned and obstacles overcome, and Mitchell couldn't help noticing that several of them had been at the restaurant that night, had witnessed his family's cruelty, had apparently decided it was worth mentioning in speeches about character and choices. Then Alina took the podium, and the room went silent in the way that meant everyone was actually listening instead of pretending to listen while checking phones. She began with humor, thanking the planning committee and making jokes about college memories that landed perfectly, reminding everyone that she'd been funny before Mitchell had trained her to be quiet. The audience laughed genuinely, warming to her in ways they'd never warmed to Mitchell, despite his family name and professional credentials. Her tone shifted gradually, moving from nostalgia to something more substantial. She talked about marriage, about partnership, about what it meant to love someone who couldn't see you because they'd stopped looking. She described the restaurant incident, but not as trauma or violation, as clarity. She'd been given divorce papers as a birthday gift by people who thought they were destroying her, and she'd signed them immediately because they'd accidentally given her permission to stop pretending their cruelty was love. "Some people think strength means enduring," Alina said, her voice carrying across the ballroom without amplification, commanding attention without demanding it. "But sometimes strength means recognizing that enduring is just another word for accepting less than you deserve. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say, 'I'm done,' and mean it. Not done fighting, not done existing. Just done accepting that someone else's inability to see your worth means you're worthless." She talked about the women who'd helped her rebuild, gestured to Patricia and others in the audience, explained that she'd learned resilience by watching women who'd survived worse and chose joy anyway. She discussed her business, her foundation, her work helping women leave relationships that were slowly killing them, while everyone around them insisted they should be grateful to be loved at all. "I was married to someone who confused ownership with partnership," Alina continued, and Mitchell felt every eye in the room avoid turning toward him, while still knowing exactly who she meant. Someone who thought having a wife meant possessing someone rather than knowing them. "And I stayed for years because I believed that if I could just become enough, he'd finally see me. But enough kept moving. The target kept shifting. I kept shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate a whole person." She described their marriage in broad strokes that were devastating because they were so relatable. So many people nodding along, recognizing patterns in their own relationships or relationships they'd witnessed. She talked about miscarriages grieved alone, about celebrations forgotten, about the slow erosion of self that happened when you loved someone who treated you like an inconvenience they'd agreed to tolerate. But then her speech shifted again, moving from pain to purpose. She talked about documentation, about protecting yourself legally before relationships ended, about building exit strategies while still appearing compliant. She shared statistics about financial abuse, about emotional manipulation, about families who conspired to keep people in relationships that served everyone except the person trapped in them. "I documented everything," Alina said, and her voice carried steel wrapped in velvet. "Every conversation, every forgotten promise, every time I was made to feel small by people who needed me to shrink so they could feel large. And I did this not for revenge but for the record, so I could never gaslight myself into believing I'd imagined the cruelty. So I'd have proof that my pain was real and my choice to leave was justified." She invited Patricia to the stage, and Patricia's story silenced the room completely. A teenage girl paid to disappear by a woman who thought money solved problems, who raised her daughter alone while the father was erased by his own mother's forgery, who'd kept quiet for years because speaking up meant fighting people with resources she didn't have. But she'd kept records too, had documented everything, had waited for a moment when someone might actually listen. Jordan joined her mother at the podium, speaking without notes, her voice steady. She talked about growing up knowing her father existed, but being convinced she wasn't good enough to meet him, learning eventually that it was the other way around. She described seeing Mitchell for the first time in the hospital. How he'd looked at her like she was a problem to solve rather than a person to know. How he'd offered things he thought she needed without asking what she actually wanted. "My mom taught me that showing up once doesn't erase years of absence," Jordan said, looking directly at Mitchell for the first time since entering the ballroom. "That being present because you feel guilty isn't the same as being present because you care. I have a good life. I have a mother who chose me every day. I have people who know my name and use it with kindness. I don't need a father who sees me as evidence of his mistakes. I need people who see me as myself." One by one, other women took the stage and told their stories. Rhonda describing years as Bernard's secretary and mistress, watching him commit fraud while treating her like she was too stupid to understand what she was witnessing. Imani explaining how Trevor's gambling nearly destroyed her finances before she discovered it, how his family paid her to keep quiet rather than getting him help. Keisha detailing false accusations and destroyed reputation. Yolanda describing plagiarism and betrayal and the cost of trusting someone who viewed friendship as transactional. Each story was distinct, but they shared DNA, the same pattern of the Owen family treating people as disposable, using them until they were no longer useful, then discarding them with money or lies or both. Mitchell sat listening to an oral history of his family's cruelty, told by women they'd never imagined would speak up, whose silence they'd purchased without considering that payments expire when power structures shift. Angela Rivera, the television producer, closed with an announcement that her investigation had aired that evening, that anyone interested in seeing documented evidence of systemic abuse could watch it online, that the Owen family's pattern of behavior was now public record, supported by testimony and documentation. She looked directly at Mitchell when she said this, not with triumph, but with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd finished difficult work that needed doing. When the speeches ended, the ballroom erupted in sustained applause. People stood, crying and hugging, sharing their own stories in smaller groups, turning the reunion into something between support group and celebration. Alina was surrounded by well-wishers, business cards exchanged, connections made, her life expanding in real time while Mitchell watched from his table at the back. He tried approaching her as the crowd thinned, rehearsed words dissolving before he could speak them because what was there to say? But Alina saw him, excused herself from conversation, and gestured toward the balcony doors with an expression that held no anger or anticipation, just weary acceptance that this conversation was inevitable. They stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking city lights, the same balcony where they'd first kissed as college students, when everything was possible and nothing was broken yet. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, though neither mentioned it because stating the obvious wouldn't change anything. "You came," Alina said. "Not a question, just observation." "I needed to see you," Mitchell admitted. "I needed to say something, though I'm not sure what." "Sorry seems inadequate. Explaining sounds like making excuses. I just needed you to know that I finally understand what I did. What I didn't do. Who I failed to be." Alina looked at him with the patient distance of someone watching a stranger work through emotions that no longer concerned her. "And now that you understand, what do you want me to do with that information? Forgive you? Tell you it wasn't that bad? Offer absolution so you can stop feeling guilty?" "I don't know," Mitchell said, because honesty was all he had left. "I don't know what I want, except for you to know that I see it now. I see you. Too late to matter, but I finally see you." "You see who I became after leaving you," Alina corrected gently. "You see the version of me that emerged when I stopped trying to fit into spaces designed to keep me small. But you never saw who I was during our marriage because you never looked. And understanding that now doesn't change what happened then." Mitchell opened his mouth to respond, but Alina raised her hand, stopping him with a gesture she'd probably learned from years of being interrupted. "We're going to talk," she said. "But not yet, not here. When you're ready to listen instead of just waiting to speak. When you understand that my forgiveness isn't something you earn, but something I might give for my own peace. When you stop seeing yourself as the protagonist of my story and start understanding you were the antagonist I had to escape." She turned back toward the ballroom, toward her life, leaving Mitchell standing on a balcony that held memories of who they'd been before they became who they were. And he understood that this wasn't an ending but a pause, that tomorrow he would hear things he'd spent years avoiding, that Alina wasn't done teaching him who he'd been, because he clearly hadn't learned yet. Chapter 10. The Gift She Gave Herself. Mitchell returned to the balcony the next morning, arriving early because Alina had texted him a time, and he'd spent the night rehearsing what he'd say, knowing that every word he'd prepared would be wrong, but preparing anyway, because doing nothing felt worse. She arrived exactly when she said she would, carrying coffee in a travel mug and wearing clothes that looked comfortable rather than performative, ready for conversation rather than confrontation. They sat on a stone bench that was cold enough to feel through clothing, and Mitchell started talking before he could stop himself, apologies tumbling out in ways that sounded desperate even to his own ears. He explained about family pressure and not understanding and mistakes he'd made because he'd been young and stupid and too influenced by his mother's opinions. He talked about how he'd change if given another chance, how he'd be different now, how he finally understood what he'd had and what he'd thrown away. Alina listened without interrupting, her face calm and attentive in the way of therapists hearing stories they'd heard before in different versions. When Mitchell finally ran out of words, when he sat breathless and exposed, waiting for her response, she took a sip of coffee and smiled with something that looked almost like affection for who he used to be, rather than who he was now. "You're still making this about you," she said gently. "Still centering yourself in a story where you were the supporting character. Still trying to find a version where you're the hero who learns his lesson, rather than the obstacle someone had to overcome." Mitchell started to protest, but Alina continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "You want to know what I learned from our marriage? I learned that love isn't enough when the person you love doesn't see you. I learned that compromise becomes self-erasure when only one person is compromising. I learned that some people will take everything you offer and still complain you're not giving enough. And the only way to survive that is to stop offering." She turned to face him directly, and her eyes held the clarity of someone who'd spent years thinking about this, processing this, moving beyond this, while he'd been stuck in denial. "Mitchell, you didn't fail our marriage because you were a bad person. You failed it because you never showed up as a whole person. You were always performing for your family, seeking your mother's approval, trying to prove something to people who would never be satisfied. And I was collateral damage in your quest for validation from people who taught you that love was conditional on meeting their expectations." "I know that now," Mitchell said, and he did know it, could see it clearly in ways he hadn't been able to see while living it. "I understand that I chose wrong, that I sacrificed you for them, that I lost something irreplaceable." "Yes, you did," Alina agreed, and there was no satisfaction in her acknowledgement, just statement of fact. "You lost me, but more than that, you lost who you could have been if you'd chosen differently. You spent so much energy trying to be who your mother wanted that you never figured out who you actually were. And that's not something I can forgive because it's not about me. That's something you have to grieve on your own." Mitchell felt tears he hadn't earned falling anyway, and Alina didn't comfort him because his comfort wasn't her responsibility anymore. Hadn't been her responsibility for a long time, even when she'd still been trying to provide it. She simply sat beside him and let him cry, bearing witness without offering absolution. When he finally composed himself, Mitchell asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Do you hate me?" "No," Alina said, and she meant it. "I don't hate you because hating you would mean you still occupied space in my emotional life. I don't think about you enough to hate you. I think about who I was when I was trying to love you, and I grieve for her sometimes. But you're just someone I used to know, someone who taught me what I wouldn't accept anymore." She explained that her revenge hadn't been in destroying his family, but in becoming indestructible herself, in building a life where his opinion of her mattered so little she could wish him well without irony or bitterness. She talked about the women who'd helped her, the work that fulfilled her, the foundation that carried Jordan's name and helped mothers who needed support their families wouldn't provide. "I didn't orchestrate your family's collapse," Alina said. "I just stopped protecting you from yourselves. Every client who left your business did so because they were already unhappy. Every employee who spoke up had been mistreated for years. Every crack in your family's facade existed long before I stopped spackling over them to maintain appearances. I simply stepped aside and let consequences find the people who'd been running from them." Mitchell asked what she wanted from him now, what he could do to make any of this better, and Alina's answer was the most devastating thing she could have said. "I want you to be happy, genuinely happy in a way you never were with me, because my happiness is no longer connected to yours in any way, and I need you to understand that severing that connection was liberation." She explained that she forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness was something she did for herself, refusing to let the past colonize her future, choosing peace over resentment because she had a beautiful life that had no room for anger strong enough to tie her to him. She wished him genuine healing, hoped he'd find therapy and do the work to understand why he'd needed his mother's approval more than his wife's respect. Hoped he'd become someone his daughter could be proud of, even if it was too late for relationship. "The cruelest thing you ever did," Alina said, standing and preparing to leave, preparing to walk back into her life that was waiting, "wasn't the affairs or the restaurant or the years of neglect. It was making me believe that love required me to shrink, that partnership meant silence, that I was the problem, when really I was just the only person trying to solve it. You taught me I wasn't enough, and the greatest gift I ever gave myself was realizing you were wrong." She hugged him then, briefly and without ceremony, the way you might embrace a distant relative at a funeral, acknowledging shared history without promising shared future. She told him she hoped he'd find peace, that she meant it sincerely, that his peace just didn't involve her anymore, and she needed him to understand that boundary was firm and final. "Goodbye, Mitchell," Alina said, and it sounded like benediction rather than dismissal, like release rather than rejection. "I hope you learn to love yourself enough that you stop seeking validation from people who taught you love was conditional. I hope you become whole. I hope you choose better next time. I hope you're happy. I genuinely do." Then she walked away, down hotel stairs and through doors that closed behind her, with the soft finality of books ending, and Mitchell watched her disappear into a life where he was footnote rather than chapter, supporting character rather than lead, someone she'd survived rather than someone she'd need. He sat alone on the balcony, holding divorce papers that had become the most expensive signature of his life, understanding too late that his mother's gift had freed the wrong person, that there were no returns or exchanges or second chances for presents nobody should have given in the first place. Mitchell understood finally that Alina wasn't his redemption arc or his opportunity to prove he'd changed. She was a woman who'd survived him, who'd built a life so full of purpose and joy and meaning that he'd become irrelevant to her story, except as the darkness she'd walked through to find light. She'd given him exactly what he'd asked for, and in doing so, she'd taken back everything he'd never deserved. As Alina disappeared into the mourning crowd of people who knew her real name, who saw her real face, who celebrated her real victory, Mitchell finally understood that his mother's gift had accomplished something magnificent. It had freed a woman from the prison of being loved poorly, and that liberation was worth more than every year of their marriage. every moment of their history, every word of his apology combined. Because freedom, real freedom, was the only thing you could give yourself that nobody could ever take away. The end.